Hey everyone. So before we get started, just out of curiosity, if you could raise your hand if you either run a bug bounty or have participated in a bug bounty in some form. Looks like maybe half the audience has their hand up. I think the case that we're going to make for the half of their audience that did not raise their hand, that you may have actually unwittingly participated in a bug bounty in some form through another security tester's research. And we're going to go through a couple examples that kind of outlines that. So first, why are we qualified to talk about this? Who are we? So my name's Dylan. I'm a security researcher. I'm a bug hunter. I was, for a little while, top 100 on BugCrowd, but that was a couple years ago. These days, I co-founded a company called Truffle Security, which is built on top of an open source tool called TruffleHog. And I do security research on the side. So talking at Black Hat, this is my second time, and probably third time talking at either DEF CON or Black Hat.
Hi, everyone. I'm Whitney. I'm an attorney, but I'm not your attorney. I work really closely with security teams at various in-house companies that I've worked at throughout the years. I helped build the Coordinated Vulnerability Disclosure Program at Electronic Arts, and I support my current security team at Asana in our various bug bounty programs.
So in general, if you look at most bug bounty programs, they say don't touch other users' data. They say try not to touch other users' data. They say only test with your own account. Don't involve other users in your testing. So this is an example of Uber's policy for their bug bounty, where they outline that in one of the bullet points. And you can see this is pretty common language. It's actually in a lot of different programs. They say, make sure you're only testing your data, don't access other people's data. So this talk being about data privacy and bug bounties, we're in a pretty good spot. We've told our hackers to not touch data that doesn't belong to them. And I think we should be good.
Yeah, we're good.
Dang it. So close. We almost had it. This was, for me, when I was testing, I accidentally caused some problems. Hey, Whitney, listen, I was testing a program doing their bug bounty, and I accidentally accessed some data that I shouldn't have accessed. I wanted to check with maybe my neighborly, friendly lawyer. Is there anything I should do here? Could I get in trouble for this accident?
Oh, that's a good question. Why don't you tell me what happened?
Yeah, so I was testing this type of vulnerability called blind cross-site scripting. Basically, I just replaced my username with some JavaScript, and I threw it into a system and forgot about it. And then that JavaScript, what it does is if anyone executes that JavaScript unsafely by rendering my user data unsafely, it'll take a screenshot of whatever that page is, and it'll send me a copy of that page. So what happened was somebody had accessed an admin page that was insecurely rendering user data, and it had a list of every user in the entire system. And all of that got screenshotted and got sent to me, and I accidentally got a copy of everyone's user data.
Ooh, did you disclose everything to the program?
Yeah. So I definitely attached all the screenshots. I walked them through all the steps that I did. I was 100% transparent every step of the way.
That's great. Since you told them you had some of the data, did you delete the copy of the data that you had?
No, I haven't done that yet. Is that something I should do?
Yeah. Didn't the program ask you to delete all of the data that you had in your possession?
No, they never asked me that. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, it might be kind of complicated to have to delete all this data. It's not super straightforward.
Oh, interesting. Complicated how?
Yeah, so about that, there's actually a couple of systems that I use when I do my testing, and it probably results in a copy of this user data ending up in a couple of different places. Some third-party systems, some systems in my control. It's not just one copy of the data.
Oh no, it sounds like the data's everywhere. What systems? How? Can you list them all?
Yeah. I think we can walk through this. Okay, so Basically, the employee browsed to that admin page, and that's where the data started. And then I use a third-party testing system called XSS Hunter to manage that like screenshotting thing I talked about. So from the laptop, the screenshot got sent to XSS Hunter, which is not managed by me. It's managed by just like a person. And then he runs that in AWS. So we have like AWS that has a copy, this random person that has a copy, and then that emailed me a copy of the screenshot too. So I guess my email provider has a copy, and then I downloaded a copy onto my hard drive, and then I run Time Machine, so there's another copy on my backup hard drive, and then I attached all of that to the bug tracking system. So there's another copy in the bug tracking system. I think that's all of it.
Wow, okay. Let's try to delete data everywhere you possibly can. If your backups don't roll off, try to delete your backups. Do some of the third parties where the data's been captured allow you to delete the data?
Ooh, that's a good question. Let me check. So it looks like XSS Hunter has a button that says delete, but there's no like terms of service or anything like that. So I don't actually know if it is deleting the data on the back end when I click that button. And then the bug platform itself actually doesn't have a delete button. So I don't think that there's an ability for me to delete that copy. But I can definitely delete the copy on my hard drive. I can delete the copy in my backup. And I can probably delete the Gmail copy, since Gmail terms of service says that deletes the data when you click that button.
Has this been resolved with the company? You know, have they closed the ticket and fixed the vulnerability?
So yes, they closed the ticket, but I still have access to the ticket. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, my bug platform account, like I'm scrolling through some of my old submissions, and I'm finding like there have actually been other examples in my account where I've accidentally accessed user data, and it looks like all of those old tickets, I can still log into them and still access that data. Like none of it has been cleared out of the bug system, even though the tickets were closed out as fixed a while ago.
Wow, I have to imagine other bug hunters have this problem. Do they?
I can ask. I know a couple friends who are some proliferary bug hunters. So it turns out I talked to a couple of friends that I know that are pretty good bug hunters, and 100% of them said that their Bugcrowd accounts and HackerOne accounts are exactly the same. When they log in, they just have like a ton of different privacy issues that are years old, and they can still access those issues.
And they can download the data.
Yeah. Even though the issues were closed a while ago, they still have access to the data that they attached to the ticket. Maybe because these bug tracker systems have the ability to request public disclosures, I mean, there's enough of these examples. Maybe if we request all of them, some of them might actually let us talk about this and share some of these examples. I mean, it doesn't exactly, they might say no, but I mean, we could try, and then we could have specific examples that we could share with other people and bring some visibility to this. Oh, yeah, that didn't work. So they did not allow us to publicly talk about this. Okay, well, look, there's a bunch more researchers and a bunch more tickets. Maybe if we just keep requesting, eventually we'll find some programs that allow us to talk publicly about these issues. Whew. I was not expecting that. Okay. Looks like there was a program or two that's actually going to let us talk publicly about these issues. That's pretty cool. Neat. Okay, so just wanted to maybe break the fourth wall for a bit and highlight most of these requests got denied. The vast majority of programs did not want us talking about privacy leaks that impacted their companies. Of the small number of companies that approved these requests, we just want to give a huge shout out to these companies for allowing us to talk publicly about these issues. We don't by any means mean to shame these companies, since these are the ones that are allowing us to be transparent. And the vast majority of these companies actually denied the request. So with that being said, here's a real world example of this happening. I was pen testing Indeed, the job search company, and a developer over there had run a little one-off sketch notebook on their laptop that they had written their own custom HTML to do some research on some of their users. And so they pulled in a whole bunch of users onto their local notebook. It was maybe on the order of thousands of users. And they insecurely rendered those users, and blind cross-site scripting fires. A screenshot gets sent up, and I accidentally end up with a whole bunch of PII, or personal data, that I didn't mean to access, but I got a copy of it. And what's interesting here is that when we requested to publicly talk about this issue, they said, sure, no problem, just make sure if you have any screenshots, you redact out any of the personal information. And that's super interesting because they're kind of self-aware of the fact that I still have maintained access to the data through this ticket, even though the issue was closed out years ago in this example. So 3 basic questions here. Was I ever asked to delete data? No. Do I maintain access to the data through the ticket? Yes. And then was there ever a public disclosure or notification about this data leakage? Not to my knowledge. And my email address was included in the leak, so if they had emailed all the people affected, I probably would have gotten an email. Okay, so here's another example. This one is with Google. Basically a very similar situation where an employee was doing a little one-off on a script that they had written locally. They had pulled in this case, tens of thousands of user records, which includes PI, personal information. And in this case, same deal, they insecurely rendered it. Screenshot got sent up to XSS Hunter, and I end up with accidentally a copy of tens of thousands of user records. What about in this case? Was I asked to delete my copy of the data? No. Did I maintain access through the ticket? Yes, and in this case, it uses Google's issue tracker, since they don't use a third-party issue tracker. And within Google's issue tracker, still able to log in and access that data. And did they do any notifications? Not to my knowledge. Again, my email was in that. So that's what the story was until a couple of days ago when I actually shared an advanced copy of the slide deck with them. And we got this email back saying, we're going to actually change some of our processes. Can you please delete your copy of the data? So this issue was like 2 years old or something like that. And for those 2 years, I was never asked to delete my copy, still had access to the ticket, et cetera. But as of a couple of days ago, as a consequence of this talk, Google's actually changing their processes internally, and they're going to be deleting data that's attached to tickets, which is pretty neat. Okay, one final example that I was going to share with you all was another pretty large, significant company with a similar story, albeit it impacted a lot fewer user records. And when they got an advanced copy of the slide deck, they actually changed their minds. They gave us preliminary permission to talk about it, and then in the 0 hour, they said, actually, we're not comfortable with you sharing this publicly, and they said, please, remove any information about this bug. Very similar story to the others, but can't talk about this one. Okay, so we talked about some other researchers. So what's the deal there? I reached out to a couple of bug testers that I knew, and I said, hey, do any of you have stories that you might be able to share publicly? And of those, similarly, most of these stories, no, could not be shared publicly. But I did find 2 researchers who did have bugs that had already been written about publicly, that they already had permission, and it did impact user data. And so they said, yeah, go ahead, include those. The first one is through a pen tester. His name is Shubs, and he was doing some testing against Uber, and he found that he could get access to other users' data through a bug in AMP script. So he was trying to just pull basically like his user by putting in his name, Shubs, but as it turns out, that is a less unique name than maybe he assumed, and he ended up with everyone who had the word Shubs anywhere in their user data. So he queried that name and then came back a whole bunch of people that just had Shubs anywhere in their user data, and he ended up with a bunch of user records, unwittingly. Here is his blog post that he put on Asset Note, and you can see he has redacted out the user data, but I asked him in the original ticket, was it redacted or did you have the raw data? And he said, well, the original ticket had the raw data. And I said, okay, well, were you asked to delete it? He's like, no. I was like, okay, well, do you still have access to the ticket that has the raw unredacted data? And he was like, I mean, yeah, I can still log into it. It was a couple years ago, but I can still log into my old tickets. And then I asked, okay, well, did they ever notify the other Shubses? And he was like, to my knowledge, the only public disclosure that ever happened here was the write-up that I did on my blog, and that the other Shubses weren't notified. Similar story here with another prolific bug bountier, Sam Curry. I reached out to him and asked him if he had any stories, and he said, yeah, I did a write-up a little while ago on Starbucks where I could actually access 100 million customer records. And so maybe the title is a little bit clickbait here. I asked him, did you actually access 100 million records? And he was like, well, no. I mean, I proved that I could, but I didn't actually access 100 million records. I accessed, maybe 5 or 6 people's records that weren't mine. And it was a bunch of information that came from those 5 or 6 records. And I asked him the same question. But before I get to his answers, I just want to maybe call out here, if it's not obvious, I've been using Dolly to enhance some of the imagery in this talk. And I thought this one was particularly good. It was basically digital data spills out of coffee. And I thought this was a pretty cool image that came back from that. But I asked him, did you delete your copy of the data, or were you asked to delete your copy of the data? And he said, no. I said, if you log into the ticket today, does it still have the unredacted data from the 5 or 6 that you tested with? He said, yes. And I said, were there ever disclosure notifications that went out to the people that were impacted? And he said, not to his knowledge, other than the write-up that he did on his blog. So I think the takeaway here is that these are not one-off examples. These privacy leaks in bug bounties are actually really common. And for every example that we can share publicly, there are 100 examples that can't be shared publicly. And so I think it's time that we start a conversation about it and see what we can do to reduce the impact of some of this. So why does it happen? Why do we have these leaks? Well, sometimes it's an accident, right? Like in the example that I walked through before with the cross-site scripting, usually when you test blind cross-site scripting, you have no idea where that payload is going to render. You throw it into one system, sometimes it comes out in another system. You don't really know what that screenshot is going to be. There are different ways to test blind cross-site scripting, but in general, some of the most popular ways can lead to data leakages by accident. So that's fairly common. But another thing is, sometimes it's not an accident, right? Sometimes the researcher goes that extra step because they either feel like they have to prove impact, or because honestly, in this screenshot, the triager in the bug bounty requests that they go that extra step. And in this example, this is a real screenshot I took from my issue tracker. It said, please prove that you can leak sensitive information. That I showed them that you can, have access to this thing. That's not enough. Please show that sensitive data can actually be leaked out of that. And have you do that without accessing the sensitive information? So I guess in those 2 dimensions, the first incentive to leak this sensitive data is just because if the researcher can show more impact, usually they get paid more. So that's the way bug bounties are set up. The more impactful the bug is, the more the researcher is compensated. And so in proving that they can access other people's data, they might be showing more impact and trying to get paid a little more. The other incentive is from the triager. And this one is a little bit more interesting. I think the triager is often inundated with a whole bunch of garbage submissions. Basically a whole internet of people saying, I found some bug, I found this thing or whatever, and the vast majority of them are not actually valid bugs. And the triager feels fatigued, they feel worn down, and if they were to actually run every single one of these submissions to the ground, it would take more hours than they have in the day. And so oftentimes, they'll just reply to all of these submissions, hey, can you give me a little bit more information? Can you push that bug one step forward? Can you show me a little bit more so that I can get through these issues a little bit faster because there's just so much garbage that came in? So those are the 2 main incentives that can play, both from the triager and the researcher side, that can lead to some of these privacy issues. And then, like we mentioned before, thank you so much to the companies that allowed us to talk publicly about it. But for every one of those companies, there are hundreds more that will never allow us to talk publicly about them. And then beyond that, there's a universe of companies that aren't even running bug bounties, that have these data leakages, and they aren't even notified about them because they don't have a mechanism to have that disclosure path. A couple things to call out here. The first is that we do believe bug bounties are a positive force for change, and that companies that run bug bounties are in a better place than companies that don't. And the other thing to call out here is we don't by any means mean to shame any of the companies that we've talked about, because there are so many more companies that are going to never talk about these things because they don't want to ever talk about them publicly. And in that same vein, I think it's pretty common for journalists to run clickbait gotcha articles every time a company does talk about an internal incident. Here's an example of that. If people don't know, HackerOne runs their own bug bounty for their own infrastructure. So they're a company like any other company, and they've got internal services that they need to secure like any other company, except they've always championed a spirit of transparency where any bugs that they have, they're going to talk about them publicly. They believe that that's the best long-term direction for the industry, and so that's kind of neat that they always publicly talk about their bugs, but it comes back to bite them because every time they do, some clickbait gotcha article comes out and says, look at the bad thing that happened. And that is a pressure for other companies to not talk publicly about their issues. And so a reframing of maybe what that article could have looked like might be to say, HackerOne champions transparency and shares an internal incident that other companies wouldn't have otherwise shared. Okay.
So why should you care? Data seems to be everywhere. What can we do about it? Can we even get to fixing this problem? The answer is probably we're never going to get to perfect, but we can take incremental steps to move forward.
So here's one reason why you should care about this. I talked about XSS Hunter as a third-party testing service that's just maintained by a guy. Well, that guy I happen to know, so I just pinged him and I said, how much data has leaked into your system? Like, can you just send me a screenshot of your database so I have an idea of like how big this is industry-wide? That's the screenshot. It's 1.66 terabytes of data that has been blind cross-site scripting screenshots that have been sent up to this service. I mean, it is a huge amount of data sitting on this central point of weakness. Similarly, as a result of this talk, I realized my user account in the bug systems did not have two-factor enabled. That meant that if somebody were to log into my account, the bar for doing that was a lot lower than it could have been. And that's probably the case for a lot of other researchers. Probably a lot of researchers run their account without a really hardened authentication mode. And if these researchers have access to many tickets that have many different privacy issues, you can see how that might be a problem.
So we can tell it's a trend. So let's try to clean up some of it. Let's take some of that toxic waste to make it a little bit less toxic. So let's start with the bug bounty program. If you build it, you have to prepare for the worst. So you can't go into building a bug bounty program without making sure that you have the fundamentals built first. You have to be prepared to receive the vulnerabilities, to address the issues, to work with an attorney like myself in your company if you have access to one, or other stakeholders at your disposal. So I'm a lawyer, I've said this already, but I'm not your lawyer, so none of this should be construed as legal advice. And if there's one thing that you take away from my talk to a lawyer. It's not that scary. We're here to help. And while we can't get to perfect, there are lots of opportunities for prevention. Basic data governance principles, data lifecycle best practices will help get you there. You have to think about a bug bounty program as a series of data lifecycle. So let's work closely with the privacy and compliance teams to make sure that you're building a bug bounty program with that in mind. So let's walk through where we can make small incremental progress and steps in each of the areas that Dylan outlined in his example. So first of all, with the researchers in the program, create policies asking researchers to stop before pulling data and stick to it, right? If the incentive to get paid out is only if you're asking them to pull extra data and you don't know what that's going to look like, you need to be prepared for the consequences of what that might mean for your company, your legal obligations as a company to potentially do breach notification, which is an internal examination that you need to do with your legal team. Think about what your end-to-end program looks like and where data might leak, and consider that when you're communicating with your stakeholders. The first time that your legal team hears about your bug bounty program should not be when you have an issue. So tell them, explain to them what you're doing. There are lots of lawyers who are new in this area and lots that are experienced. If you work with them, they're gonna help you build a better bug bounty program. So let's start with the employee laptop. First, internal apps should have the same level of security as external apps. The type of data processed should define the level of security. So even if it's happening internally, you need to make sure that you're thinking about the security on your internal apps. Also make sure you're thinking about roles and responsibilities, right? Every time, I am the first person in my company, whenever someone's like, do you need access to this data? I'm like, dear God, no. I don't want to be the person that causes a potential breach or issue. Give me temporary access, whatever it may be. So really think about, does the person need access to hundreds of thousands of records? Do they need access to all of the data? Tailor your access controls accordingly. Now, that's a big ask, but it's going to help in the long run and prevent larger leaks from happening. Second, as we're looking at platforms like XSS Hunter and other platforms, be aware of what data they collect. So as a researcher, when you're going through, be aware of what potentially might be ending up somewhere else, because a company may come to you and say, where's the data? Who has it? Because I ask these questions myself when I work with folks on bug bounty programs. Have you deleted it? So keep track of that so you're prepared to answer those questions. And even if the answer is no, I don't know if I can delete it, or it's in this program and I don't have the ability to fix it, etc. So where you can, go back and delete relevant data and try to make it so, if possible, you're not sending data to places that you don't want the data to go. For Gmail, this is an obvious one, but it's shocking to me how many times people just send stuff over email. In fact, the number of times I'm asked to send my Social Security over email is alarming, but don't put stuff in email. Just avoid it if you can. Delete the email so you don't have a copy of in your possession. If you're thinking about how to share data with a company, stick it in a G Drive link and share the link so that the data is not being perpetuated in various email systems, because you're going to send it to maybe a security at email if there's not a bug bounty program, and now we have data in who knows how many email boxes because that email may have been forwarded to an entire security team. In your hard drive, as a matter of course, again, this is an obvious one, but don't download anything to your machine. If possible, if you have to do it, delete it when you do and delete it after you submit it. Finally, for backups, have a good data retention on backups. Let it roll off, implement a data retention policy, or spot remove it from backup if necessary. I hate spot removal from backups. I never like to touch backups. They're the emergency, so good retention on your backups is really going to be the best bet here. And then finally, platforms. We love the platforms, but they need to get better at giving their customers the ability to do data governance in the program. You cannot currently delete attachments. It is difficult to automatically remove the researcher from a ticket after it's been closed out. These platforms are treasure troves of personal data and customer vulnerabilities. If leaked, this could have major consequences, and you need to think through how they store and manage this in a bug bounty platform. And so companies, if you use platforms, ask them to consider allowing you to set a data retention policy to have more control over your data, so we're not just adding more and more into a handful of accounts like Dylan's, where it becomes a treasure trove of personal data. And then finally, there are lots of places the data could flow that we have not mentioned here. So this is just one particular scenario. The data could leak to so many other places.
So, I mean, what should this data flow look like? We talked about researcher using XSS Hunter, and that causing like a whole bunch of issues, and then there were a couple other third-party systems involved. I think maybe there's an opportunity here for the platforms themselves to operate their own testing infrastructure, to be able to consolidate all of the testing data inside the bug platform where they have total access to the data governance and maybe even better usability, like push to file a ticket buttons that are easier on the researchers as well. Right now, the researchers don't have what they need to do their testing, and in a lot of cases, they may not be sophisticated enough to stand up their own infrastructure, so they're having to go out and seek out these third parties that aren't involved with the bug bounties explicitly, and then they get inadvertently involved as a result of the testing. And maybe another thing to call out is this is also an issue with general security testing, whether that be a pen tester from a firm or a bug bounty, but we can at least solve for maybe the 80% by consolidating the bug platforms and having them run their own testing infrastructure.
I really hope we see the platforms develop in this space. It would have a large impact. So maybe some of you are here to understand what are the legal obligations. I'm sure this is what everyone wants to know.
That's why I'm here. I want to know if I'm going to get sued.
Well, good news. I'm going to give you a very typical legal answer, and that is it depends. There's no one clear cut, this is how you avoid legal liability, you're okay. So let's go over a quick refresh, really high level of bug bounty in the law. So in the United States, there's the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Ooh, yeah. As a result, it has been used against security researchers in the past. Generally, bug bounties operate in this idea of what is authorized. So by asking and having a program, you are kind of allowing individual researchers to be authorized to potentially hack your systems in a way that would be allowed under CFAA. There has also been a new DOJ memo, which recently announced specifically that if you are hacking in good faith, the DOJ is not going to prosecute. Yay! But that good faith line could really, really vary depending on the situation. So it's important to just be thoughtful here, because legal issues happen when people get pissed at each other. That's just, if people feel not heard, if they feel frustrated, if they feel like you're not coming to the table and having a conversation with them, this is one of the reasons where like the law starts to come into play, and we don't want it there. So there's some resources here that I recommend, if you have any questions or want to know more, but again, engage your legal team should you have any questions, or if you're a researcher, there are lots of resources out there about, kind of best practices, and I hope that you will take some of these general guidelines that I'm about to give. So what are the legal obligations? That's what everyone wants to know. Here are some company takeaways. To make sure that any data pulled may not result in any potential harm to an individual or customer, that's generally when somebody does, do I have to do breach notification? It ultimately comes down to, is there potential harm to the individual? That's the standard in the EU. That generally is what triggers a lot of breach notifications. We don't quite have that same standard here in the United States. It has to be specific types of data. Actually, we live in a 53-state breach notification regime, and I say 53, Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, et cetera. But make sure that the data doesn't persist on any system. So you need to ask the researcher, hey, please delete the data and confirm with me in writing that you have deleted the data. You need to do this. You need to make sure that you are mitigating any potential harm, because that relates to that legal analysis of whether or not you have to do breach notification. And the reality is no one wants to be harmed by this data. We want to keep it. This program is good. So make sure that if you're being asked to delete the data, that you actually do it. So along those lines, some researcher takeaways. Say it, don't spray it. tell the company about the vulnerability. Don't pull and spray data to various third-party systems, your hard drive, your backup drive, the bug bounty platform. And if the company says to you, have you deleted all the copies of the data? Don't say you did if it's not true. Lying is not going to help you here. It is much, much better to just be honest and truthful. Hey, here's where I think the data is. I've deleted all the data that I can possibly delete. There might be a copy here, but I can't be sure. I guarantee those companies will work with you to address the issue or close out the ticket accordingly. If you used other third-party systems to pull your data, delete it. We kind of talked about that earlier, but that's really important in making sure as you're building your kind of repertoire of tools that you understand where data might go and how you might be able to govern that data accordingly. And finally, the platforms. Enable your customers to have more control over their data in the product. Allow programs to set mandatory 2FA for hackers. This has been a huge success, apparently, when implemented, and we'd love to see this more broadly used. And then finally, accurately talk about your privacy practices in your privacy statement or in your privacy policy. And if you don't use a platform, still think through how you're sharing the data. Again, to that email example, really make sure that you're not spraying the data everywhere. So the general takeaways that we want you to get from this is we love bug bounties, and we love the companies that allowed us to talk about it, and we don't want to shame them, but we're hoping to get to a next level of conversation about now that bug bounties are much more prevalent, that they are a must-have for companies to triage and coordinate vulnerabilities. We'd really like to get to a 2.0 and make it a little bit better for the users whose data is potentially leaked.
So sounds like I might be sued if I piss a company off, but just try not to piss anybody off.
That's basically where we're landing,
Okay.
but they probably won't sue you.
Okay, yeah, I hope I didn't piss any companies off by including them in this talk. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.